it's 12:01. I think we should get started now, and people can still filter in as they need to, and you can leave as you need to as well. This is, of course, the brown bag session from the Research and Scholarship Office at the CMPD. And we are excited to have Dr. Karikari talk about his research entitled Same Storm, Different Boats. It's about students' experience with COVID-19, so very topical. And we will just let him get started. You can go ahead.
So thank you, Sherry, and thanks to everyone who's made time this afternoon to join this brown bag session. It's very much appreciated. And I'll be sharing my slides now. Yeah. So brief introduction. I am Isaac Karikari, an assistant professor with the College of Nursing and Professional Disciplines, and more specifically with the Department of Social Work. And over the course of the semester, that was last spring, we moved from what we would say was a relatively quiet period into the stormy or choppy waters of the COVID-19 pandemic. And within that period, I would say, yes, there was a lot of talk, there were a lot of discussions going on locally and nationally and internationally as well. And it all had to do with the pandemic. It all had to do with the pandemic. And I was fortunate to have been able to get some research done. And that is what I present today. So for this presentation, I will be sharing what I learned through interviews and one focus group discussion with students. And it's not something I did all by myself. I received great support. So I'd want to, first of all, acknowledge some co-authors who partnered with me on this. So besides
You're suddenly muted.
You're muted.
Oh, thanks for the reminder. So yeah, so I started off by saying that during approximately close to a year ago, we moved from a relatively quiet period into the stormy or the choppy waters of, the COVID pandemic. And there were a lot of discussions going on locally, nationally, and internationally. And within that period, I had the opportunity to conduct some research with students here at UND. And before proceeding to share the research, I'd want to acknowledge the people who've been supportive, or who are supportive on that journey. So from this research, I've been able to get a manuscript together that has currently been submitted. And I didn't do that all by myself. I have my co-authors, so I'd acknowledge them, though they are not on this platform. So I partnered with a professor with the public health program here at UND, Professor Grace Kakari, and also with another professor from Indiana University School of Social Work, Professor Eric Shrey. They are not on this platform, but I would want to acknowledge them. And I'd also want to acknowledge the chair of the Department of Social Work, Professor Flanagan, because when I initially had the idea, I consulted with him. I also got some support from Professor Tande Desri, then got support as well from Professor Bruce Reeves of Social Work. And one of the staff members, Brent, yes, Mr. Brent Gerhardt was also helpful with the recruitment of participants. And the IRB was also helpful as well in approving the study. And in other ways, before doing this bring back session, I also had the privilege of sharing this with I would say, within our department, the Department of Social Work. So I'm appreciative of the faculty and across the board, like throughout the college as well. So going back to how I initially started, talking of moving from a relatively quiet or peaceful period into the stormy or the choppy waters of COVID, yes, discussions were ongoing, and something that was readily acknowledged was the widespread impact of the pandemic, the impact on, the economy, like people being laid off and all that. So those discussions were taking place. And in the midst of all that, there was sometimes a tendency to speak in generalities or to somehow homogenize what the experiences were or looked like. And it was in giving some thought to that I realized, okay, there are so many voices that need to be heard. There are so many people whose stories probably could be dismissed or could be ignored, sometimes unconsciously. And there is great value in hearing those stories. A popular quote or a quote I really like is something said by Albert Einstein, and it's that, not everything that counts, can be counted, and not everything that is counted really counts. I'm paraphrasing. And from a research standpoint, sometimes we tend to think quantitatively, or we give a lot of attention to quantitative research. But with attention to people's experiences and stories, I realized going the qualitative route was going to be helpful in capturing their experiences. So with that, this study was conceptualized because, again, in talking about COVID and all that, the attention was sometimes on the economy, then also concerns about, I would say, the medical and pharmacological concerns dominated as well. And those are good, but then that isn't all there is. And again, being in North Dakota, being in a rural region, one sometimes wondered whether there were any unique experiences or differences compared to what one would, hear on the news or read about, online. Because New York would say, severely hit, and other urban regions or urban areas. So there was that interest as well. And looking at the literature that was emerging around that time, not much attention had been given to urban areas. So that was also, I would say, another motivating factor for this study. Again, as the university prepared to, should I say, transition to a different way of serving students or providing learning, one also wondered whether it was all about just learning education, because everyone would acknowledge that our lives are not, let's say, unilinear, but there are so many aspects to the individual or to the person. And going back to this whole idea of the conversation being homogenized, I also wondered, are there aspects, of people's lives that are not being covered, or aspects to which adequate attention is not being given? And with that in mind, thinking theoretically, something that I'd want to say came to the fore was having a systemic approach. And with that, in conceptualizing the study, systems theory and the person in environment model, which is used extensively across disciplines, were applied. In that, with systems theory, it provided that opportunity to think about the complexities, people were facing, and also thinking about how various social systems and economic systems, I don't say systems in general, were being impacted. Then beginning to think about how, the impact on those systems affected the individual. So with that, the study began, and the study began. And in recruiting students, I went with what will generally be referred to as the convenience, the convenient approach, but also use some purposive sampling because there were specific stories I wanted to hear, I was interested in hearing. So the focus was on students. And wanted to capture or cover students across various departments and colleges across the university. So I reached out and I received some support. So the recruitment overall was successful. The interviews were conducted via Zoom, lasting approximately 30 minutes. There were some that went, beyond that, close to an hour. I think a few exceeded that. And I also had one focus group discussion with 3 students. Overall, there were 21 students involved in the study. Majority of them, I would say, came from the Department of Social Work, but I also had some students from nutrition and dietetics, had some students from engineering, had some students from aerospace and aviation as well. And I'll go back to the previous slides. So at this time, or at the time the study was conducted, some of the students had left campus. There were some who were on campus though, but some had left campus. So, students were spread across 12 cities or towns and across 4 states. And I mentioned that majority of the students were from social work. Majority of them were also identified as female. And in terms of the demographics, racially or ethnically, majority of the students identified as white. And there was one student who identified as mixed race, being Native American and also European. But students, I would say, in a sense, was a bit diverse, and it appeared to be quite proportionate to the demographics within the state as a whole, and even within the university. So having conducted those interviews, the data were analyzed thematically. I used thematic analysis, and I used what is referred to as an essentialist approach, which basically focused on, just what, participants expressed overtly, talking about their experiences or realities. But I also applied what is referred to as a constructionist paradigm or framework, trying to understand the sociocultural context in which these experiences were being shared. And now I move on to the findings. So overall, one thing that became evident was that, yes, the impact of the pandemic was widespread, and students were impacted in several ways. But it was evident that the impact was also multi-layered, in that it was touching or affecting various aspects of their lives. Another interesting thing, though, was that there were variations in these experiences. And from everything I found, or from everything that participants shared, two main themes were identified. One was the impact of COVID and how students were coping with COVID. but with those two main themes, the overarching theme was same storm, different boats. And these, like this, that particular phrasing was derived from something a student shared. And some of the other themes, there were sub-themes that were also identified. Some of the sub-themes were also taken directly from phrases students used in describing the experiences. And I'll be sharing some of those soon. And I felt the same storm, different boats phrasing was appropriate. It was a very, I would want to say, apt reflection of what was happening, even locally and nationally, beyond the study. So on the impact of COVID, something that was revealed was that one, it affected what a person's normal life would look like on a daily basis. In that prior to the pandemic, students, for those who were on campus, they were here on campus going for classes and all that. But subsequently that changed and things had to transition online. And for others, they were already online, but the pressures or things happening in other areas or aspects of their lives, they were feeling the pinch, so to speak. So one student described this as it's like riding a big roller coaster, which I have highlighted. And they conveyed this, or they further elaborated, noting how there were days or there were times when things appeared to be very okay, very good. They were on top of things. Then on other days, not so much. And to move beyond, I would say, that overt expression, it essentially highlights or points to some of the mental health challenges or effects, or the anxieties, stemming from, the pandemic, and how it had created, some disruption in people's lives. And in sharing these experiences, to sticking with the theme of, mental health, when students or some participants were sharing their experiences, they will initially maybe make some kind of I would say, measured acknowledgement or minimal acknowledgement of the impact. But then as they continued, sharing, expressing things and saying more, you realize that the impact was probably being minimized, or it's possible that at that point, people were not, maybe, I wouldn't want to say denial, but we're not recognizing the full impact until they began to talk about it or process it, in those interviews. So for instance, this student named Claudia, and I'll pause and say that all the names have been anonymized for confidentiality and privacy. All the names have been anonymized, and also to help preserve confidentiality and privacy, I am not indicating on the slides which program the student belonged to. At some point, maybe in sharing the findings, I may make a reference or two, but did those things on purpose. So for this student named Claudia, in presenting in sharing the experience, first of all, they mentioned that the only impact is work. But as they continue to share, you realize that there is much more than that, because there is a part two to this. There's a part two to this code, and I'll move to that slide. And even as you read it, I'll proceed to talk about what she said. So she initially mentioned that the real impact was with her work, but as she shared more, it became apparent that it was affecting her academic work as well. It was affecting her academic work as well. Then, as she continued to share, it also became apparent that there were she had some concerns, or I would say fears, about possibly, infecting her children with it. Because she worked in a nursing facility and mentioned having to do multiple tests and some of her co-workers being off because they have contracted it and losing some residents to the pandemic. And she had been tested twice. At the time of the interview, she was waiting to get the results of her second test. So she had this, initially she said it was work, but then it became apparent it was impacting school as well. Then it also became apparent that she had some fears or concerns about her children possibly contracting it. And that is where you see that question, I'm afraid, if my kids get it, what would happen? And still on the impact, as others also talked, yes, about the impact, then it became evident that their family life had been impacted. So for some, initially it was work, but with the changes or modifications to work, it was affecting their home life. It was affecting their home life. And in the nature of the impact on the family also varied. So whereas for Golda, with schedule changes at work, there was a challenge in being home or more or less like spending time with family. For Mary, the concern had to do with her son who had to be home due to the pandemic, failing in school. So in addition to their own experience, and Mary is the same person who had described the experience as being like a big roller coaster. So in addition to dealing with the direct pressures or the direct effects on herself, they also had to bear this other burden because of how their child was coping with the pandemic. Then with one participant, they used this phrase of having to be in hypervigilance mode. And the way they described it was they had a child with underlying health conditions. And because of where they worked and they being at high risk of contracting it, they had to take extra steps or precautions so that when they came home to make sure that they minimized or reduced the chances of infecting or affecting, their families. And part of it had to do with, the virus itself, to some extent, or with some people being asymptomatic. So not really always being able to tell if one had it or not, so they had to take those extra steps. And another point on the hypervigilance, one participant also shared about how their workplace had given them some protocols so that outside work, they had to minimize contact with people. So for them, their grocery habits or patterns had to change. And a lot of that responsibility had to be taken up by their partner. And they expressed that it got to the point where it was beginning to become stressful and a strain because the partner felt they were having to do all of that. So still discussing or talking about the impacts, I've made some allusions to the academic impacts. There were some more impacts here in that for students who were online, it appeared again, they had somehow been forgotten because the university was moving to online learning. So it appeared there was that assumption that people who were online were already okay or were good. And much attention wasn't given to the fact that maybe other aspects of their life had been impacted as well. And that could make, the whole experience challenging or very difficult for them. And that is what the students, experience shows, or that is what the code demonstrates. And I'll pause as you take some time to read it. Because the key thing that struck me when they shared this experience was how the classes did not skip a bit. And professors, delaying a little in saying, oh, maybe something may be happening. And to say more about the students' experience, their partner had to quarantine for a while because some people, I think a number of people in their workplace, that's the partner's workplace, contracted COVID or had COVID. So their partner had to quarantine, and this student couldn't go home or be with them for a number of weeks and had to go and stay with her parents. So that was another impact. And in as much as one may think, okay, that is probably a different aspect of their life, it has some clear implications for the ability to concentrate or focus on school work or on academic work. So that's something they shared. And quite a number of students shared, the experiences with the transition from campus to online learning. Some adapted to it well, but there were others for whom it was a challenge. Part of it didn't have to do with just the courses they were taking, but getting, I would say, better acquainted with the technology. And it's something I think is often maybe something that is often not discussed as much, in that when students are on campus, because of the nature of instruction and learning, they do not have to use maybe all the technological tools, or the technological skills may be limited, but then that may not be recognized or that may not be seen. But when students have to transition to online learning, for some students, that became a challenge or it became a struggle. For others too, it had to do with just, the nature of online learning and having a preference for in-person interactions. One reason for going or selecting this particular code out of the many was the fact that they highlighted or drew attention to, online learning or distance learning being much more than just getting on Zoom or just, getting onto an online learning platform. But there's a discipline that is needed. It's like you need a whole new orientation to be able to do this. And they weren't prepared for that, or that they weren't in that frame of mind. So that was very, very important to note. And again, with the transition to online learning, for some programs, it wasn't a very good or fitting alternative. So they had to put things on hold completely. And these two students whose quotes I present here are in the aviation program. So for them, flight instruction or learning had to stop. And for one, yes, there was the nervousness about completing training, but for the other, there was also a concern about their timeline for graduating being, messed up or getting disrupted, which was something personally in conducting the study, I don't think I had given attention to how, students' graduation timelines or academic timelines could be disrupted. But this came to the fore in this particular interview. So for the impact, yes, so far the ones I've highlighted point to those who, would say had a lot of challenges, but there were also students for whom one would say maybe not much of a challenge, or students who were putting things in perspective in a unique way or in a way that is noteworthy. So for Pete, for instance, he mentioned that, it's more or less this has been our way of life, so with the lockdown or partial lockdowns and all that, so nothing appears to have changed so much. And that was interesting to note, which brings something to the fore, that when we think of how people are being impacted by this, depending on how one maybe lived previously or conducted themselves previously, the experience at this point, may be different, because the change to their life may not be, would say, may not, the change to their life may not be that huge or may not be so different from how they normally live. Another student sharing, their experience and putting things in perspective, noted that financially, like they hadn't suffered any losses. And also because they didn't have any pre-existing conditions, they kind of, in as much as there like things were, they were inconvenienced, they were putting things in perspective and realizing that, okay, they were privileged, maybe compared to others. And they said that, yes, so they are trying to keep, complaining to a minimum. Then there were other students who in the midst of, the pandemic and everything, still saw what they refer to as a silver lining. And the interesting thing though is for some of these students, they also had, for Goldie, for instance, Goldie is the student who talked about having to be in hypervigilance mode. But at the same time, they saw a silver lining. So the contrast was unique, or it was worth noting that on one hand, there is this challenge, but on another hand, people are able to see, something good, or able to focus on something positive. So that was also that was also very noteworthy. And for them, the silver lining was, the family time. For another student, the silver lining was that they were able to complete their capstone project. So this is Mary who had concerns about her son failing in his school. But then there was also a silver lining. So you see the contrast again. You see somehow an attempt to, would say, develop maybe a balanced view or balanced perspectives to say that maybe it's not overall, maybe it's not completely bad. So that is it for the first main, theme, which was the impact of COVID. Now to the second theme, which was coping with COVID. The way in which I framed or posed questions was to identify what was helpful and what was less helpful as students try to cope with COVID. And that is how the results or the findings are presented as well. So for one of the aviation students, and this student was an international student whose parent company had a contract or has a contract with the university for him to train or complete training as a pilot. And fortunately, his parent company had made arrangements with the university. So they had a shuttle available would say at the height of the pandemic, during that period, they had a shuttle available that was helping them move around from place to place to get, some basic amenities. And that was very helpful to them. Then in sharing his experience, he noted that, there was a time whilst working on campus, some students refer to him as coronavirus. And that is because, they looked at him and he's Asian. So they looked at his features and the political debates or some of the, I'll say the propaganda going on around that time with the virus being termed, China virus and all that. I think students or the people who called him coronavirus, maybe seeing his features, assume or make the assumption that, yes, he's Asian, he might be Chinese, and, said that. But he also indicated that, yes, that was only one instance. And overall, he was receiving or having great support here at the UND. And for others, what helped them to cope? Yes, family support. And it's interesting to also see the point about being able to go out for a walk. So being able to experience nature was also one way in which, other students coped. For what was less helpful, I haven't gotten to that part yet, but for one student, what was less helpful was not having the gym. So I bring that up now to contrast it with, this student, again, Derek, who is also an aviation student. I referenced him earlier, who is an aviation student, talking about being able to, go outside, physical activity. Yeah. And overall, students, I think, praised the university for, the rapid transition to online learning and professors being available. There were some who raised concerns about maybe some professors not being very supportive, but then you also have the alternative viewpoint of others, having very good experiences with professors. And again, in the midst of the pandemic, other universities or other institutions were we're making sure, all students vacate or leave campus, but UND didn't adopt that approach. And with this student, who is an international student, in sharing, their experience, they brought us up and gave the university some plaudits for that, acknowledging that if that had happened, maybe it would have been very, disastrous, because then flights, were canceled, or people couldn't fly out, people couldn't fly in. So if students, especially international students, had to be put out or had to vacate campus, that would have been, very, very unfortunate. And this is one quote I found funny. It was one of the highlights for me, because in this interview, and this was part of the focus group, the student talked about essentials and was like, rice, like there was no rice, or they couldn't find rice, anywhere. And I was like, oh, okay. And initially, it took me some time to process it further, why the emphasis on rice. And he went on to say, I don't care about the stereotypes, but, to them, rice is an essential. And it brought up this other issue about nutrition and about diets during the pandemic, and how people may have been impacted by that. If they couldn't get, the diets they need, or the particular or specific foods they needed. Because we know that, essentially or literally we were in more or less like something like a period where things were being rationed, because you go to like the grocery stores, and you are sometimes given a limit as to how many things you can buy or how many items you can take out. So it brought up that question, at least in thinking about, this student's submission. It brought up that point about, okay, how did other people fare so far as, their nutrition, their diets were concerned. And not just in Grand Forks, because as I mentioned, students were located, 12 different areas across 4 states. For students in more remote or rural areas, what was happening? And one of the students shared something about, because they operated a food pantry, and they shared, something about maybe the government helping out, and people coming to the pantry more than usual to get, support or to get food. So what was less helpful for some students, and Golda here worked with a geriatric population, or works with a geriatric population, and they share this experience of, they being held responsible, or having to bear the brunt of, families, because families were concerned that, their elderly, parents or relatives could contract the virus and die. And they were blaming the staff for that. So she was dealing with some pressures from school due to changes in work schedule. She was dealing with, her family life had to some extent been disrupted. Then there was also the lack of support at work as well, where, as she says, being screamed at, going to work for just 8 hours a day to get screamed at, because not only the families but also the residents, more or less like would say projecting their fears and their anxieties onto the staff. And I'll say that all these things contribute to or demonstrate, the not only the pressures, but the multi-layered, impacts people have to contend with or have to deal with. And with Claudia's quote again, with this one, in the attempt or in the effort to deal with the pandemic, one would have expected support or all hands to be on deck, but it appeared that wasn't the case everywhere. And there were some concerns which students who were, I would say, domestic students or American citizens didn't experience, but international students experienced. And that had to do with, again, with some of the policies that government had implemented and the possible impact on them. So limiting opportunities for career development, for future training and all that. The OPT is in full, it's optional practical training, and the CPT is also another form of practical training that students who are on a visa can apply for, so that they can either do internships or they can seek employment whilst going through school or after they finish school to beef up their skills. And there were a lot of discussions going on nationally, immigration related, about suspending those programs, And these students, using Jamal's code, were making attributions to the pandemic, having, a role to play in all of that as well. So those, I would say, are overall some of the findings. And I want to quickly discuss some of the limitations from this study. So with the study having been done during I would want to say the height of COVID, people's experiences now may not necessarily be the same. So when it comes to any attempts to, maybe even apply the findings, that has to be taken into consideration and things have to be better contextualized. Again, with this being a qualitative studies typically do not attempt to generalize, but then the findings are still, important and relevant and would say transferable to other settings or to other situations as we try to understand people's, experiences. So with everything presented so far, in concluding and also in thinking about the implications of, the study, its findings, I'll say that it generally highlights the value of, having a systemic way, having a systemic approach or systemic way of, thinking of the impact of the pandemic, in that we may be dealing with students or looking at students, but they are not just students, they are embedded within other systems. So the family, the embedded within the family unit, as much as the embedded within, would say, the academic institution and in their workplaces as well. And in one way, there tends to be this ripple effect, so that what happens in one sphere of their life tends to carry over or cross over into other spheres, So that is something worth noting. A systemic approach is very, very important, or is very critical. Another thing that comes to the fore and still applies with systemic thinking is how the experience cuts across both across the domains of micro, meso, and macro levels. Because when policies were implemented, the decisions the university made or UND made, would say had very important implications for students, in that people being able to stay on campus, that means there were things they didn't have to worry about. And I'm definitely sure that it helped ease some of the mental health pressures and challenges people would have had to deal with. Another point worth noting is that in terms of the impact, yes, it varied and it was more caustic on some students than others. And with that said, when it comes to efforts to provide support, it's important or it's imperative that we try to tailor our responses, and we try to somehow do some differentiation and identify the specific challenges and needs of, each student, of each person we are dealing with, and provide them, adequate support. One other thing that also came to the fore, or that can be deduced from this whole study, is the human capacity to adapt, or the human capacity to, would say, think in a way that is balanced, or hold things, yes, think in a way that is balanced. And I say this in relation to how, in the midst of the challenges, people were still able to identify the silver lining or the positives. And in working with people, those are things we can capitalize on or leverage. Those can be good starting points, like when working with people or engaging with people, especially for social workers practicing, therapeutically, or providing therapy, or providing those kinds of like clinical supports. And again, noticing, identifying the nuances or the extensions in how we respond to students. So there may be the institutional level, but then definitely it's important that, there is also the departmental level as well, or at the program level, because institutionally things may be done, but it may not always, trickle down to the departmental level. So I would want to say maybe covering all bases is always critical. And it moves from that to also how individual faculty members also respond or engage with students. So in all, I'll say that is all I have to share or present for now. I'm glad to take field questions, anyone has. Thank you once again.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Let's go ahead and open up questions. If anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat box, or go ahead and just unmute and ask your question. Oh, Maura Ferguson asked, did you notice any significant differences on the basis of gender?
Wow, that's a great question. So, with most of the participants were female, and for those who, and the male students, only 2 of them were married. Only 2 of them were married. And they didn't, and of the 2 who were married, only one had children. Only one had children. So I say that to just bring this up, that for the female students, most of them were married or had children. So their responsibilities were different. And they appear to, I would want to say, they were dealing with more of the, mental health challenges or pressures or the stress, the stresses, So to talk about significant differences, I'll say on that basis, yes.
All right, do we have any other questions?
Professor Kakari, one of the things I noticed spring semester was some of my very best students seemed to have some of the most struggle. They were, so I don't want to overblow this, but their intention on perfectionism, they were used to doing a very, very high level work, and they were finding it challenging to do the regular level of work that they had, the standards that they'd set for themselves. Did you see any difference along those lines? I don't think there was any clear measure in your questions for identifying that, but is there some sense of the type of student in terms of how they were most affected by COVID?
So, and yeah, thanks for the question. I'll say that to somehow, piggyback of what you said, I didn't pose a question like that directly, but what people shared in terms of, academic work, one student, and it's the student I use the pseudonym for Mary, talked about how thinking of their capstone project, it was like, wow, it's this huge task. It needs to be done this way. And their professor was like, you know what, take your time, take your time. And it kind of eased, the pressure, because I'm sure she was committed to doing excellent work and she had to deal with some other pressures. But hearing this thing of, take your time, like ease the pressure. And another student, I didn't use a quote from her, but talked about having more time to to focus on her work because she had been laid off. So she had lost her job, and losing her job, she saw it as, okay, give me more time to now focus on school and get schoolwork done. And another student also talked about school being a helpful distraction. And I found that to be interesting. And one student, I think that was Golda, talked about, getting to the point where they were like, now I'm just going to settle for B's. I don't need to worry about trying to get A's. I'm just going to settle for B's. So I saw some of those variations. I'm not sure if I'll necessarily link it to perfection, but I think students were thinking of academic work in different ways and trying to find ways to adjust to, or ways to adjust or to do good work. I'm not sure if that answers the direct question though, but I hope it provides some perspective on how students responded to getting academic work done.
Yeah, I think that it's relevant to not stereotype students and to categorize them and to recognize the diversity even within these different kind of types or groups of students.
Yeah.
One other quick, more an observation than a question, the quote about rice I found very interesting. And COVID has revealed systemic issues that existed before, and we didn't always think about them. I've become increasingly aware of, for instance, the dietary needs of the Muslim population in town, many of whom work in those sectors of the economy that were hardest hit in terms of COVID, where social distancing was not always possible, elder care industry, etc. And the need for halal meats that our traditional supplemental food support systems didn't accommodate that, or other cultural differences in accessing food support. So that was an interesting quote, both in terms of our students, but the broader community.
Thank you. Yes, so there's a question saying, I noticed that many of your participants seem to be employed in the healthcare field. Were some of your participants employed in other fields? I would say yes, a few. So I know one was employed in a school, and they talked about, in terms of the impact, they talked about school being off, like they worked in, I think, an elementary or middle school, and school being closed, so they didn't have to go to work in the normal way. It had transitioned online or so, but still they were having to find ways to support low income students and either delivering meals and all that. And they started doing that, but had to, I think at a point in time, pause because of, the fear of possibly contracting it and having elderly parents. So there are a lot of factors, yes, for people to take into consideration. Besides that person, there was another student who I think was doing his internship at the time with a state agency. And they were like, in their community, within the state agency, people were observing the protocols, but in the larger community, and I'm using larger in quotes, in the larger community, people were not so much into observing the protocols. And they lived in a rural region, which was agrarian. that is another thing I noticed though. And it takes it beyond the question that is asked, but that's another thing I noticed. And it came from two participants who were in areas, I would want to say agrarian areas, or areas where farmers have a big presence. And one of them was like, they are not just observing the protocols. Let me leave it at that, because there was a political angle to it, but I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Okay, we have about 4 minutes left. Last call for questions. All of your comments will be saved with the attendance list, so Dr. Karikari can review them as well. So thank you for all your accolades in the comment section. All right, well, thank you for your participation. And I want to thank Dr. Karikari for presenting on this topic. It was a really good presentation and really can show everything that students are going through during the pandemic. Thank you.
Yes, and thanks to everyone too. And thanks, Sherry, for coordinating everything.